begin, I'd like to introduce our Sufi meditation practice and teacher, Wajid Galian. He's going to lead us to Sufi breathing meditation exercise for 10 minutes, and we're going to start our lecture. So, welcome, Wajid.
The Sufis do a lot of practices that involve the light. And, well, that has changed. Thank you for that. I had the light right in my face, and I thought, whoa, you know, this is, it's going to be amazing. Anyway, my name is Wajid, and I represent the Inayati order in Seattle, which was founded by Hazrat Inayat Khan and exists both in India and in many parts of the world. I will try to create an attunement so that we can be all in one mood, so that we may be united in our atmosphere for the rest of the talk. So, if you feel comfortable, I will ask you to put your feet firm in the ground. If your legs are crossed, uncross them, it's better. If your back is against the chair, better to keep the spinal column straight. It allows for the sympathetic, parasympathetic, and other energies to travel to the body freely, more freely. And this is a well-known practice that some of you may know, actually. It's called the purification breath. And it involves doing some breathing practice, short breathing practice, with earth, water, fire, and air, and ether. The first one is earth, which is in the nose, out the nose, and I will each time indicate what the next one is. So if you would kindly close your eyes and allow yourself to tune in to your breathing. And as you do that, allow yourself to relax. Make sure that your shoulders, your neck is relaxed. Perhaps putting your hands on your knees or on your thighs. Watch your breath. And the idea of the practice is that you allow yourself to direct your attention from whatever the mind is doing or thinking or creating to the breathing. So it's really straightforward, even though the mind tends to have its own idea of what it wants to do. And gently, normal, perhaps a little slower, you breathe in the nose and out the nose 5 times. And I'll do the counts starting now. Perhaps you can feel in this moment of attunement the magnetism of the earth that is always around us, the gravity pull upon the body, Every time we move, stand up, move our arms or legs, we are going against the gravity pull. It has an influence in our body, on our body. So we are centered upon the breath and allowing ourselves to experience this relationship. Next, we do the water breath. The water breath is a breath that follows the natural flow of water from the clouds into the mountains and prairies and rivers and riverlets, always going down, eventually ending on the sea. So there is a natural descending motion. So the breath is in the mouth, in the nose, out the mouth. And as you breathe out the mouth, you can form with your lips like you were going to whistle, perking your lips. So there is a slight pressure. So in the nose, out the mouth. So allow your attention to feel the motion of the waters in your body, your relationship with the movement, all the aspects in the physical body that are liquid are associated with the water, and they are numerous. As you breathe, by being consciously attentive to that experience, you are enhancing the experience and the movement. We know that consciousness has a strong influence on different parts of the body. The lymphatic, blood system, all the other aspects. Now we move to fire breath. Now the fire breath naturally moves upward. When the fire burns, it burns upward, slowly diminishing. So here we do in the mouth, again perking our lips, drawing the air in and exhaling through the nose. We start now. If your mind wanders, bring it back to the breathing. We know that the fire element in the body is very important. we have an exact measure of the fire that keeps us healthy, when we are not well, we are invaded by elements that disturb the harmony of the body, we get a fever. The fever tries to burn and eject those foreign elements. If it gets worse, the body tends then to shut down the heating process, and we get cold, and motions become more difficult, to the point that we have difficulty moving. So the two extremes, either we slowly freeze internally through rigidity, or we are overheated through excessive fire. And we have to admire the fact that we are able to maintain a very steady middle range temperature that works for us. So doing this breath and being conscious of it does enhance that experience of the body with the fire. The next breath is air in the mouth, out the mouth. Again, perking the lips so that there's a slight pressure coming in and a slight pressure going out. We begin. Recognize this movement of air through our lungs as extremely important, as it creates a filtering. But beyond that, we also know that it moves in the space between the atoms that form our body. Our body feels solid, but there is a space. We know scientifically that there is more space than solid. And even the solid themselves have space in themselves. And so the breath is a purification of certain elements. And as you breathe in, you can feel yourself expanding, just your aura, your psyche. As you breathe out, you feel the distance. Breathe in, the body expands. Breathe out, the body contracts. And the reverse effect on your surroundings, your presence. It's like entering a room and feeling confident and self-contained, and everybody will notice if they haven't worked on being attuned to their central self. And you will make a difference because you are in harmony. All the parts of your body, mind, heart, and soul are coordinated in unison. And that is a powerful experience. This practice generally is offered to be done in the morning, if you can, outside or by a window, to reinvigorate yourself. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's a very standard practice that precedes any other practice. It is like an attunement, collecting oneself, coming together, falling to oneself, calming the mind, calming the emotions, calming the motions of the body, and being present to oneself and taking it from there. It can be, this is a short presentation. This practice can actually be a meditation that lasts an hour, if you will, with many details that helps expand that perspective. But for now, I'm glad to have been invited for a short introduction, and I thank those who have organized it, and I thank you for being patient with me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Wajid, and thank you for turning this auditorium into Sufi Meditation Center for a sec. Please join me in giving a round of applause to Wajid. Well, hello everyone again, and welcome to the Gardner Center for Asian Art and Ideas. My name is Haley. I'm the Public Engagement Manager at the Seattle Art Museum. It's great to see some familiar faces and new faces joining us for this new series of lecture. Welcome to all of you. And before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the Seattle Art Museum respectfully acknowledges that we are on indigenous land, the traditional territories of Coast Salish people. We strive to honor our ongoing connection to these communities past, present, and future. We are very excited to open today's lecture for our spring series, Architecture of Asia, Sacred Spaces and Cultural Landscapes. The last fall, we explored architecture and sacred spaces around Asia. We focused on the built environment, sacred spaces in urban settings and ecological landscapes, but also how architecture was employed as a tool of emancipation in forging an alliance in South Asia, and how artists envisioned sacred landscapes of their homeland and created their sanctuaries through artistic visions. The 2023 Spring Series will expand and take a deeper look into both ancient and contemporary architecture. Each talk will examine the works of visionary architects, and we will rediscover sacred sites, ceremonial spaces, including reimagined, recreated cities that suffered wars, and visit the works of renowned architects, including architects known as Architect of Light, Tadao Ando, and Louis Kahn's works across Asia. Now I'd like to take a moment to thank our longstanding partners, the Jackson School for International Studies at the University of Washington. Also, thanks to our Dr. Mimi Gardner-Gates for her continuous guidance, and to our trustees and museum members for allowing Sam to do the work of connecting art to life. I also want to thank the entire SAM staff and teams who has been working behind this program, and without their support, these programs won't happen. I would like to just make a brief announcement before we get into our today's lecture. Your admission to the SAM Galleries is provided with Saturday University lecture, so we encourage you to visit the Beyond the Mountain contemporary Chinese artists on the classical forms and see new installations today. There's some significant works that's displayed, including Zhang Huan's work that actually took place at the Seattle Asian Art Museum, and there are much more to explore. There are also great new shows happening at the current exhibition at downtown location. One of them is Reverberation, Contemporary Art in Modern Classics. Also, I would like to mention there's a Chronicles of Global East exhibition that's been happening that follows many stories related to Silk Road, maritime routes, and where countless artistic trades took place. And lastly, I think we were missing a slide, but please be on the lookout for a new exhibition that's coming in spring. ECAT, A World of Compelling Cloths, exhibition that features over 100 textiles of elegant Japanese kimonos, works from Central Asia and Indonesia. So now on to the first lecture of our spring series. We are so happy to have our professor Fatima Quraishi from University of California, Riverside joining us today. Fatima will deliver a talk titled Landscape of Leisure, Politics of Piety. After our presentation, Fatima will be joined on stage for conversation and Q&A with Professor Anand Yang. Anand Yang is a professor of international studies and history at the University of Washington, a renowned scholar of South Asian studies, a former chair of Department of History and former director of Jackson School, and also our longest standing partner at the Gardner Center as a member of Jackson School. Anand will be doing the honor of introducing Fatima. Over to you, Anand.
It's a long ways to get up here. Thank you, Haley, for that gracious introduction, and thank you, Gardner Center and Seattle Art Museum, for organizing the Puget Sound's liveliest Saturday morning wake-up talk, always on Asian arts and ideas. And thank you all for being here, and perhaps in a suitably meditative state by now. Our speaker today is Fatima Quraishi, Assistant Professor of Islamic Art and Material Culture at the University of California, Riverside, a PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU. Professor Quraishi previously held curatorial and faculty positions in Pakistan. In 2017, she curated an exhibition on Paradise on Earth, manuscripts, miniatures, and Mendicants from Kashmir at the Mohatta Palace Museum in Karachi. A specialist in the arts and material culture of the Islamic world, with particular interest in the visual culture of Muslim communities in South Asia, which today number over 500 million, so about a fourth, roughly a little bit more than a fourth of the Muslim population in the world. She is currently completing a book intriguingly entitled Necropolis as Palimpsest, the Makli Cemetery in Sindh, circa 1380-1660. This manuscript highlights a vast funerary site in southeastern Pakistan and the entangled histories involving religious communities and architectural and artistic production. Following Professor Quraishi's presentation, I will briefly take advantage of my moderator role to be the first in line to engage her in conversation before ceding the floor to all of you to ask questions. Welcome, Professor Quraishi, to the Gardner Center Saturday University.
everyone. Before I start, I'd like to thank Haley and Kayla particularly for arranging this, for inviting me. And I'd like to thank you all for being here, particularly at 10 o'clock on a Saturday. It's very nice to see everyone in the audience. Great, let's get started. On November 7th, 2021, news broke of the death of the famous Lahori Sufi drummer. Still figuring out everything over here. Pappu Sai. Born Zulfiqar Ali, Pappu Sai had come to mainstream attention as a member of the band Overload, but had long been a fixture at the shrine of his spiritual guide, the Sufi Baba Shah Jamal. Every Thursday night, Sai would join other musicians at the shrine and perform on the dhol, a barrel-shaped drum, while dancing to achieve a transcendental state. Shortly after the announcement of his death, videos began circulating on social media of his funeral procession. The procession made its first stop in the courtyard of Baba Jamal's shrine, where a startling scene took place. Sorry, we'll just go to the next slide, please. Oh, great. Sai's Tolak partners surrounded the bier, playing a final dhamal for their departed comrade. Accoutrements of Sufi shrine culture were visible in the videos. The body was covered with a green fabric inscribed with Quranic verses and topped with garlands of roses and marigolds. Some mourners fanned currency notes, which they tossed one by one at the bier and at the musicians. The rest of the funeral procession proceeded in a conventional fashion, and only the striking visuals of the dhol playing would go viral. The tributes that showered this funerary dhamal stood alongside less positive messages. Below the circulating images were also comments on the un-Islamic nature of the music playing and the lack of proper respect for the deceased and Muslim funerary rituals. The seeming contraventions of religious tradition and the protests against them in this instance are unsurprising when situated within longer histories of funerary practices in the Islamic world. Death and the internment of bodies have long been a source of great anxiety among Muslim communities and inspired a range of responses, a recognition of death as a moment of profound transition and transformation. The medieval period saw the increasing sanctification of Sufi leaders, who were enshrined in increasingly elaborate funerary structures, the focus of visitation and pilgrimage. Cemeteries and saintly tombs were highly trafficked spaces, not just for religious devotions, but also for pleasure, and were often locations where social boundaries were loosened, often to the dismay of orthodox Muslim theologians. The funeral of Pappu Sai thus participated in a long tradition of death's socially transgressive potential. Beyond a momentary transgression was the fact that death had a distinct spatial presence and affect. The architecture of death had been a constant fixture of Pappu Sai's life. Apart from his weekly performances, he would also take part in the death anniversary celebrations of other saints in Pakistan. He was not alone. Shrine visitation has long been a regular practice across the Indian subcontinent. Saintly death and its commemorative architecture have an extensive history in the region of creating spaces where city residents and visitors alike gathered to participate in a variety of activities. It is the spatial quality of death and its connection with urban life that I will speak about today. Now, while it might seem obvious and perhaps even simplistic to note that funerals and burials take place in a set of spaces, I want to dwell upon and interrogate the nature of these spaces and the roles they have come to occupy through their use. The presentation I'm making today draws upon research I've been conducting on the historic role of funerary spaces in South Asian cities and communities. And those are the three main sites that the research is focusing on. But today I'll be discussing two of the case studies. The shrine of the Sufi saint Lal Shehbaz Qalandar, who died in 1274 and is located in Seven Sharif, and is one of the most important shrines in Pakistan today. And then I'll talk about Delhi, a city where funerary sites and the dead are a ubiquitous presence. The sites I've chosen bring together a diversity of material through their scale, geographic breadth, and individual historical development. looking at them collectively brings to light significant continuities in the role of death in urban spaces. I will demonstrate how the patronage of political and religious elites over history have occurred alongside devotional rituals and communal activities, accumulating and extending the meaning of these monuments far beyond the original intentions of their construction and physical boundaries. In so doing, I argued that the dead, primarily the saintly dead, and the architecture which houses them are transformative, serving as important gathering points in cities, informing and reshaping urban centers. In the many odes dedicated to the 13th century saint Lal Shehbaz Qalandar, the saint is intimately connected with Sevan Sharif, the city where his shrine is located. The history of Sevan predates the Sufi considerably, with archaeological excavation confirming settlement as far back as the 3rd century BCE. When Lal Shehbaz arrived in Sevan in the 13th century, the city was largely contained within a fort and included both a Shaivite temple and one dedicated to Udero Lal, an incarnation of Varuna. And in the century following his death, Sevan had become a flourishing space of Sufi practice with multiple hermitages. The city would have receded into legend and ruin long ago were it not for the endurance of Lal Shehbaz's presence. Through centuries of sustained patronage, the shrine of Lal Shehbaz is at the center of everything in Sevan. Today, this city of about 100,000 permanent residents swells to almost 2 million during the annual festival of the saint's death. Little is known about Lal Shehbaz, and later hagiographies on the saint present multiple, sometimes contradictory narratives about his background. Even the question of his name is contested, though most sources agree that he was born Sayyid Uthman Marandi and was later given the title Lal Shehbaz Qalandar. That a figure known as Marandi was buried in Sevan can be confirmed through the travel account of the Moroccan jurist Ibn Battuta, in which he described his 1333 visit to the city. Elsewhere, the saint is said to have traveled extensively, including a trip to Damascus, where he was initiated into a group known as Qalandars, antinomian mystics who sought spiritual refinement through renunciation and social deviance. Lal Shehbaz has also been connected with other spiritual genealogies, including the Sohrawardi Sufi order, an Ismaili lineage through Ismail, the son of the 6th Shi'i Imam Jafar al-Sadiq, and is also claimed to be Raja Bhartari, a Shaivite ascetic. The intertwining of Ismaili, Sufi, and Hindu genealogies for Lal Shehbaz is possibly a reflection of the multi-confessional atmosphere of Sevan in the 13th century, and is perhaps also relevant to the enduring popularity of Lal Shehbaz among an astonishing variety of groups. Despite his significance, the history of Lal Shehbaz's shrine and its original architecture, like his identity, are also little known. The current structure is completely modern, built in the 1990s, and earlier phases of construction and renovation are only known through a few historical texts and architectural inscriptions. Even given these limitations, the sources conjure a picture of a shrine that has functioned repeatedly as a space for claiming power and demonstrating piety by secular political authorities. Among the earliest sources are two architectural inscriptions from the 14th century, dated 1356 and 1357, and they offer a detailed account of patronage. In their precise formulations, the inscriptions shed light on the broader cultural conditions under which patronage occurred and the role played by the shrine in Sevan's political and spiritual landscape. Most of these inscriptions are now lost, and so we have these rubbings from the early 20th century by a historian published in the Oriental College magazine, which is a college in Lahore. So we have these very sad images. The first describes construction by Ikhtiyar al-Din, a governor during the reign of the Delhi Sultan Firoz Shah Tughlaq. Beginning with praise for the ruler and extolling the saint's miraculous powers, the inscription describes the governor as a, quote, second Alexander in his chivalry, end quote. The reference to Alexander here is a reformulation of the historical figure of Alexander of Macedon. In Persian literary traditions, the Greek emperor was transformed into an ideal pious Muslim king who held up traditional customs of Persian kingship. The cultural formation was one understood throughout the Persianate world, serving as a vehicle for elites to articulate political ambitions and used by multiple figures in the subcontinent. In his usage of the term then, the governor was claiming a space for himself within a cultural milieu that extended far beyond a relatively minor city. That he chose to employ such a title on an inscription affixed to the saint's tomb emphasizes the central place of the monument within the urban landscape of Sevan in the 14th century. The second inscription documents the construction of a tomb within the shrine complex, commissioned by a Malik Sayyid Jalaluddin. The construction of a funerary monument in close proximity to the saint's grave is the earliest evidence of the spiritual magnetism of Lal Shehbaz, an indication of future clusters of graves at the site. In this inscription, the final two lines proved most interesting, if unfortunately mostly illegible. What remains compares Sevan favorably to Nawbahar, suggesting either that Sevan is a new, fresh version of Nawbahar, or that seeing it, one forgets Nawbahar. The term Nawbahar is a derivation of the Sanskrit term Nova Vihara, new monastery, a reference to Buddhist monasteries. In Iran and Central Asia, the term was a specific reference to monasteries in Balkh in Afghanistan, but in Sindh may have been referring to the region's own non-Muslim monuments, which were active and flourishing. Regardless of the precise reference, it's clear that the inscription is making an argument for the sacred superiority of Sevan because of its Sufi shrine. These inscriptions are important sources for the early history of the shrine, not only as a detailed record of work, but also regarding the formation of cultural memory around the site. Both the claim of greatness as a second Alexander and the insistence on the shrine's elevated position within a sacred hierarchy suggest that the tomb was the primary site in Sevan to articulate elite aspirations, underscoring its local importance. Following the inscriptions is a gap of almost 300 years, and the shrine next appears in a description of Sevan in the Mazar-e Shah Jahani, written by Yusuf Mirak in 1634. Along with other sacred structures, the shrine is the very first thing that Mirak mentions about the city. Such an introductory paragraph comports with early modern advice literature, which emphasized the importance of first visiting saints, living and dead, whenever one traveled to a town. Interestingly, in the same paragraph is a description of Sevan's geographic features, a juxtaposition where a group of notable religious sites are prominently situated within a narrative of natural landscape, a suggestion perhaps that sacredness is itself natural to Sevan. Also in the Mazar is other useful information about sources of income for the shrine, including the award of a village to the custodians by a Mughal administrator, to the custodians of the shrine, I should say. And the Mughal administrator is Dindar Khan. Dindar Khan is also named on a contemporaneous inscription recording improvements he commissioned for the shrine. Yes, it's supposed to be dark, sorry. The inscription that he commissions as part of these improvements has a long history, narrates a history of the shrine, its construction during the reign of Firoz Shah, as indicated by two older inscriptions, which had been removed. So there's this entire history of what is happening at the shrine. So he's not just saying what he's done, but also where these previous inscriptions were. They've been removed, his own intervention, and then says that the older inscriptions, sorry. No. Sorry. I didn't want you to be distracted by the older inscription, and I don't have an image of this particular inscription. So the sort of the final thing that this inscription says is that the old inscriptions, which recorded the construction during the time of Firoz Shah Tughlaq, that Dindar had them then placed in a wall on the tomb so as to preserve the memory of old kings. So there's this long kind of like reflective account of what happened with older inscriptions and construction. And these inscriptions and his Mirak's observations are very revealing of the shrine's status in the 17th century. As the highest ranked administrator of Sevan, Dindar Khan had control over the allocation of local resources, including land. That he chose to grant gifts of property and commission additions to this complex suggests that the shrine's custodians wielded significant power in Sevan, likely requiring political elites to court their favor. That power and influence in the region resided in Sufi institutions is also reiterated by Dindar's patronage of other shrines around Sevan. The language of the inscription also indicates that the administrator was placing himself within a history and genealogy of patronage by elites. He emphasized this by naming past rulers, with the explicit desire that they be remembered, as well as by restoring earlier inscriptions so that they were in a visible traffic space of the complex. There is a final historical inscription, dated 1759, which indicates significant shifts in how the shrine was perceived and memorialized in the 18th century. Affixed to the entrance gateway, the inscription explicitly employed Shi'i terminology, referring to the Nishane Hazrat Abbas, the standard carried by Abbas bin Ali during the Battle of Karbala. Replicas of the standard are often carried during Muharram processions, and it is possible that the shrine's association with Shi'i traditions was first introduced in the 18th century, a change that has had long-lasting effects on the shrine's identity. Today, it is common to connect devotion at the complex with Shi'i symbolism, and Muharram processions are an important part of the shrine's calendar. The inscriptions and textual sources discussed thus far document patronage at the shrine over the course of 400 years. There is no other monument in Sevan's history that has wielded this level of sustained interest and support from the most powerful residents of the city. Repeated acts of financial support, which aim to constantly improve and enlarge the shrine, almost certainly also enforce the growing importance of the shrine. Moreover, they expose the infrastructure required to maintain such significance. While the shrine remained popular in the 19th century, the sources differ considerably with the advent of colonial rule in 1843. Details were now compiled in British gazetteers, which included other material details and commented on the use of the shrine alongside a linear chronological history of elite patronage. From them, an expanded vision of the shrine emerges, including public use of the site and its changing popularity. These accounts also included details of offerings made to the shrine, ostrich eggs, peacock feathers, textile coverings, etc., as well as relics associated with the saint, a large polished stone that he purportedly wore as an amulet, as well as a staff. Thus, while Lal Shahbaz's shrine continued to dominate conceptions of Sevan, emphasizing that it remained the most important site in the city, a very different record of the shrine was produced in the colonial period, one that reflected British interest in systematically collecting data. Following a period of little activity, the mid-20th century was a period of intense change at Sevan. From the 1950s, the government of Pakistan passed a series of laws inserting the government directly into the administration of shrines, bypassing all intermediary authorities. The legislation was clearly aimed at diminishing the power and influence of custodians of major shrines. Many custodians had claimed the spiritual lineage of the saint and had benefited from decades, even centuries of patronage, and as a result exercised significant influence over politics, both local and national. The Pakistani government demonstrated its ability to replace the custodians through a series of actions. They took over the day-to-day running of the shrine, as well as the management of major festivals. These changes allowed the government to wrest control of the shrine's finances from the custodians, significantly decreasing their access to material resources. The government also began making improvements and additions to Lal Shahbaz's shrine, building a hospital, a research center, and a library. Apart from the administrative changes and monetary investment, the government also produced literature which stressed the individual piety of saints, undermining the importance of blood relations and kin networks in saintly charisma, an emphasis again clearly aimed at delegitimizing the spiritual claims of the custodians. A pamphlet produced by the government summarizing the history of construction at Sevan sheds light on how the government portrayed its own actions. Quote, "It would be difficult to say who built his tomb, for almost every pious ruler of Sindh or Sevan has contributed something to it." End quote. In a manner strikingly similar to Deendar Khan then, the government of Pakistan portrayed itself as the latest in a series of rulers participating in pious devotions at the shrine, simultaneously undercutting the intermediary role long played by custodians. Government involvement at Sevan had an enormous impact upon the shrine and the communities connected with it. The death anniversary celebrations grew even larger as the festival was promoted to a geographically dispersed audience, shifting it from regional relevance to a wider nationally significant event. As the festival grew, its economic importance for Seven also grew, making it a vital source of income for the inhabitants of the city. The government's recognition of the critical role of Sufi monuments in public life resulted in significant physical and structural changes to shrines all over Pakistan. These interventions demonstrated how shrines and the politics of spirituality were entangled with urban development. By building a variety of structures, many of which were not directly connected to pious visitation, such as the hospitals, the government effectively centered the physical space of the shrine in public consciousness and use. At Seven, these additions cemented the shrine's significance to social and communal lives in the city, reaffirming it as the central node of the city. Beyond the ramification of specific actions, the Pakistani government's intervention also had many unintended effects upon the role of Lal Shahbaz Qalandar's shrine in the broader urban landscape of Seven. It is important to note that the custodians did not lose all their authority, continuing to perform most of the main rituals at the shrine, albeit in collaboration with government authorities. And although they had decreased access to the shrine itself, they retained influence at Seven by controlling multiple hermitages linked with the shrine. Thus, legislative changes transformed the location from which they exercised power, and the hermitages became a kind of geographic extension of the shrine, a sacred aura overlaying more and more of the city. Another consequence emerging through government intervention has been the expanding funereal geography of Seven, many of these cemeteries are newly connected with the saint's spiritual presence. Associated with individuals usually marginalized in traditional Sufi institution, women, trans, and intersex people, the process by which they come to accumulate spiritual authority has recently been highlighted by Umar Kasmani. Kasmani notes that the government's disruption of long-standing consolidations of power opened up a space for other claimants to Lal Shahbaz's charisma. Looking at the figures that shape his research, the spaces from which they negotiate these claims also stand out. A number of these devotees dwell in cemeteries, many of which were not distinguished as the burial grounds of venerated individuals or notable in any other way. Despite their seemingly unremarkable nature, these cemeteries are conceived of as offering the possibility of connection with Seven and with Lal Shahbaz, as well as other worldly beings such as fairies. Such a belief perhaps stems from the perspective that all funerary spaces are liminal, spaces of connection between the living and the dead. And through their spiritual journeys, these devotees are reshaping Seven's spiritual landscape by creating new networks of devotion and spiritual authority. Seven moves to the rhythms of Lal Shahbaz Qalandar. The saint's shrine has been witness to centuries of pious acts. As I have shown, historical sources indicate that the funerary complex was regularly patronized by Seven's political elites. A close analysis of medieval architectural inscriptions also reveals that these individuals framed their interventions in language that lay claim to a wider cosmopolitan Persianate world. Later sources from the 17th and 18th century suggest that the shrine's identity underwent a transformation with the first use of Shi'i invocations. And it is from the colonial period onwards that our understanding of the shrine's functioning begins to include non-elite devotees and its relevance to a vast and growing set of publics. In the expansion and diffusion of the shrine and Qalandar's spiritual presence, the shrine complex begets other spaces of spirituality and death in the city, creating an ever-expanding geography of death that overlays the urban landscape. Shortly after partition in 1947, the Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru is supposed to have said, quote, "Maulana, half of Delhi is graveyards and mosques. Our schemes will fail if we don't have room to build," end quote. This was in response to Education Minister Maulana Azad's entreaty to save Delhi's tombs and graveyards from destruction. To Nehru, these monuments were an encumbrance, preventing a full realization of the newly independent nation-state, represented by modern architecture and construction. Such a vision was at odds with Delhi's landscape and character. Indeed, it is impossible to fully account for the many ways in which the architecture of death permeates the city. Shortly after the conquest of northern India by the Ghurids at the end of the 12th century, funerary monuments dedicated to rulers and saintly figures began to be built in the city. The earliest of these is the tomb of the Prince Nasruddin Mahmud, built in 1230 by his father Iltutmish, soon to be followed by Iltutmish's own tomb, which was attached to the Quwwatul Islam mosque complex. Since then, countless tombs and cemeteries have been constructed, marking and transforming Delhi. Medieval accounts are a rich source of information about Delhi's funerary architecture. They indicate the early development of rituals and traditions at these sites that would become established practices. These sources delineate the means by which tombs and shrines grew and the institutional frameworks required to support their functioning and long-term endurance. Our old friend Ibn Battuta proves fruitful once again for understanding funerary customs and architecture in Delhi in the early Sultanate period, notably the involvement of ruling authorities in their production and development. He describes the verdant spaces that constituted Delhi's cemeteries and the neighborhood of Mehrauli, the location of many saintly mausoleums. In addition, Ibn Battuta was appointed by the Delhi Sultan Muhammad bin Tughlaq to manage the tomb of Qutbuddin Mubarak Shah, the last ruler of the Khilji dynasty. To support his work, a waqf or an endowment was established for the monument. The Moroccan designed elaborate ceremonies for the shrine, involving elephants and large groups of people reciting the Quran, as well as the provision of food for visitors and travelers. For this, he was bestowed robes of honor from the king. There is much to be gained from his account, which not only indicates the beginnings of what will become increasingly common practices at funerary sites, namely rituals of religious recitation and food distribution, but also the creation of a state-sponsored financial infrastructure for these activities. Royal patronage was foundational for the building and upkeep of funerary architecture in Sultanate Delhi, as demonstrated by the patronage of Muhammad bin Tughlaq's successor, Firoz Shah Tughlaq. Firoz Shah's patronage of funerary monuments at the Hauz Khas Madrasa also created some of the earliest green spaces in the Delhi Sultanate. The 14th century poet Azizuddin Mutahhir of Kara described the lush gardens as a space of tranquility and pleasure for visitors to enjoy. And although it is unclear who would have been allowed access to the Hauz Khas, other sources make clear that visiting funerary spaces was a well-established practice, sometimes eliciting strong disapproval from the authorities. We learn from Firoz Shah himself that on sacred days, large numbers of women came out of the city, crowding in groups and batches, riding in palanquins, horse carriages, dolas, or astride horses and bulls, or on foot to visit the tombs outside the city. The ruler was known to make pilgrimages himself, but he disapproved of their popularity among women, claiming that it exposed them to indecent, lustful men, and he issued a royal decree forbidding women from performing pilgrimages. Concerns around the movement of women at funerary sites seems to have been a perennial concern. A similar decree was also issued by Sikandar Lodi a little over a century later. These texts, and especially the need for repeated regulations, indicate how popular pilgrimage was and what social possibilities existed through access to funerary spaces. And we know of this in other places as well. The same thing seems to happen in Mamluk Cairo as well. And there's great concerns about men and women meeting in particular. Within a few centuries, as Delhi expanded, the neighborhoods first described by Ibn Battuta, collectively known as Old Delhi, had become synonymous with the architecture of death, a status that had come to confer prestige on the city. In the Kalimat al-Sadiqin, a hagiography of the Sufis buried in Delhi until 1614, the city is described as follows. Everyone asserts its exaltedness, whether due to the fact that the great ones of the religion, the ulama among the people of certainty, the great sheikhs, the reputable wise men, the powerful rulers, and the exalted nobles have filled the city and have been buried here. The presence of funerary sites was understood to bolster the urban realm's importance to the blessing power of saintly bodies. As discussed in reference to 7 earlier, shrines were the first places visited by travelers. For instance, the founder of the Mughal Empire, Babur, first visited Delhi's saintly tombs after his conquest of northern India in 1526. However, as the Kalimat suggests, it was not only saintly sepulchres that emphasized a city's importance, but also the graves of other important figures, an idea repeated in the Chahar Chaman, the Four Gardens, the memoir of the Mughal poet and state secretary Chandarbhan Brahman. In the Chahar Chaman, the text includes an extended description of the Mughal Empire's, quote, various provinces of happy Hindustan, end quote, starting in Delhi and expanding outward to the furthest reaches of imperial dominion. In it, Delhi was full not only of Sufi shrines, but also the tomb of eminent poets like Mullah Hamid bin Fazlallah Jamali and political elites such as the Mughal Emperor Humayun and Mirza Abdul Rahim Khan, a high-ranking noble who had served the Mughal emperors Akbar and Jahangir. By highlighting a multiplicity of funerary spaces, Chandarbhan evoked an image of Delhi as a space occupied and made significant by prestigious death. In the early 17th century, this leitmotif of Delhi and death would be briefly interrupted by a new conception of the city, focusing instead on the person of the Emperor Shah Jahan. Yet, within a century, death and funerary architecture would once again displace the urban order as construction intensified in the neighborhood surrounding the shrines of two Chishti saints, Nizamuddin Aulia and Qutbuddin Bakhtiyar Kaki. As Chanchal Dadlani has noted, the shift coincided with a new practice of imperial burial in screened enclosures within the shrines, in close proximity to the saint's grave. Imperial interventions at funerary sites extended beyond burial to other projects, such as the construction of the Moti Masjid, the Pearl Mosque, in 1709 during the reign of Bahadur Shah, and the marble gateways and screens commissioned by his successor Farrukh Sayyar, both near the shrine of Bakhtiyar Kaki. The burials and the renovation projects were a means by which the Mughals inserted themselves into the narrative of a sacred space, benefiting from the blessing of being in close proximity to a saintly body, and also demonstrating to a public audience their pious actions. Imperial actions were highly influential and would prompt further burials and elite patronage of shrines, expanding their use and maintaining their status as important landmarks in the city. Elite patronage was not the only driver for the popularity of shrines and tombs in the 18th century. As described in the Muraqqa-e-Dilli, the album of Delhi penned by the Deccan courtier Dargah Quli Khan in the 1730s, funerary architecture played a key role in shaping the experience of Delhi as an urban center. The courtier's observations of the sites he visited followed a discernible pattern. He began by geographically situating the sites and praising their sacrality, and then described quotidian contemporary activities, a rich description that brought shrines to life, conjuring scenes of conviviality and devotion. Also included in the Muraqqa were important observations of the permanent residents of the area surrounding shrines, evidence of how the surrounding landscape had been transformed by the shrine. The Muraqqa's descriptions of the celebrated poet Mirza Abdul Qadir Bidal's gravesite demonstrates how commemoration could transform secular figures into saintly ones. From the poet's death in 1721 till 1760, the grave was the site of regular poetry gatherings. Multiple accounts of these gatherings are extant, allowing a detailed reconstruction of commemorative practices at his grave. Poets would gather at the grave, passing around an autobiographed copy of his kulliyat, his collected works, from which they would read selections. Those in attendance would then recite their own compositions. The performances served as entertainment and also as an acknowledgement of Bidal's status as a poet saint. The circulating autograph manuscript was akin to a relic, capturing both his bodily movements, his handwriting, and his intellect, the poetry. By giving voice to the written words of Bidal, the participants animated the gravesite through a re-embodiment of the deceased. Sometimes the poet spoke back. During his attendance in 1739, the poet Abdul Ali Uzlat opened the kulliyat, expecting the deceased poet to have known of his coming, and was confronted by verses which confirmed his belief, a bibliomantic miracle. Veneration at Bidal's grave, however, did not hinge on his literary prowess alone. The poet's nephew, Muhammad Said, had assumed the role of the tomb's custodian. Apart from routine management, he also sold hugely popular herbal concoctions, purportedly invented by Bidal. Dargah Quli seems to have been quite horrified by Said, remarking that, quote, the master's spiritual connections are alien to him, and that his economic ventures disturbed the solemnity of the occasion and disrespected the deceased, though such an aversion was clearly not shared by other visitors to the grave. In the descriptions, a heterogeneous mixture emerges of an audience that cut across social classes, partaking in solemn rituals, sophisticated literary discussions, and pious devotions, the same way that Sufi shrines do. Dargah Quli's account of Basant, a multi-day festival marking the advent of spring, brings together these narratives, connecting individual sites with a wider urban geography and the shaping of Delhi's public space and communal activities through a funerary landscape. The festival's celebrations began at Qadam Sharif, the shrine of the Prophet's footprint, where Delhi residents were entertained by qawwals and dancers, while pilgrims placed flowers at the shrine and prayed. Other acts of piety included the practice of elder qawwals rubbing their foreheads on the threshold of the shrine, following a common conceit that the architecture and dirt of sacred spaces were imbued with saintly charisma, lending them salvific properties. It is a vivid multisensorial scene, one in which women carrying porcelain perfume bottles sprinkle fragrance upon visitors, and the entire vicinity of the shrine emitted scents, another sign of its sacred status. Following a day of celebrations at the Qadam Sharif, the festival shifted to various other shrines in Delhi, where people circumambulated, lit candles, and recited litanies. The celebrations then turned to secular elite spaces, the imperial palace complex, and the residences of nobles, with the expectation of receiving some worldly goods, presumably the distribution of food, currency, and other goods. The final stop of the festival was at the grave of a now unknown figure, Azizi. Dancers gathered at the grave, washing it with wine and dancing in turns, in the belief that the dancing and singing would comfort the deceased. This is an extraordinary account. Historical records on the celebration of Basant at Sufi shrines in Delhi are limited, making Dargah Quli's description a key resource. The level of detail here is unparalleled, allowing a rich reconstruction of both the festival and the ways in which it was celebrated in an urban space. There is a notable sacred hierarchy at work in the peregrinations of the festival goers, starting at the most holy site in the city, Qadam Sharif, and proceeding from there to various significant shrines, and then to the political centers of power, and finally to the grave of an unknown figure. The celebrations included both devotional rituals and non-religious revelry, all involving movement throughout the city. There is no explicit connection between Basant and Sufi shrines generally, with the exception of Nizamuddin Aulia, from where it's been on the shrine calendar for many years. And yet, the sometimes raucous, sometimes pious celebrations were mapped onto this sacred funereal geography, reiterating that death was inextricably intertwined with public life in Delhi. Funerary monuments remained significant communal spaces in Delhi during the 19th century, but also came into contentious contact with the evolving concept of heritage sites and institutional preservation practices. Colonial surveying activities informed the creation of an archive of monuments with the establishment of the Archaeological Survey of India in 1861. This archive sought to determine and control the historical narrative of monuments by regulating the behavior of the public toward them. Significantly, laws severed the connection between monuments and the communities that surrounded and inhabited them, as historic structures were rendered dead in the language of the ASI's 1923 Conservation Manual. Nowhere was the relationship between the past and the present more slippery and more heavily contested than at funerary sites, the proposed destruction of which inspired passionate defenses from Indians. One such moment occurred in the early 20th century following the creation of a heritage list of Delhi's architecture. The decision to create the roster was at least partially motivated by King George V's announcement regarding the construction of New Delhi as the capital of British India at the 1911 Delhi Darbar, a project requiring the acquisition of enormous tracts of land in a densely populated and historic city. Between 1913 and 1916, the ASI employed Maulvi Zafar Hassan to catalogue and rank historic monuments, published as the list of Mohammedan and Hindu monuments, Delhi province, which defined the parameters by which the historic value of Delhi's monuments were judged, as well as demarcating the space occupied by them. The list was quite limited in the information it provided. Unlike the gazetteers discussed earlier, there was no interest in recording contemporary activities, since this archive was assembled to assess compensation for existing landowners, as well as the value of historic and religious monuments. Yet, Delhi's monuments refused to stay within these strict historical boundaries. Information outside of a distant past inevitably slipped into the list. For instance, at the time that Hassan documented the tomb of Ahmad Shah in Arab Sarai, it was primarily functioning as a cattle shed, though still recognizably a funerary space. Even more troubling to the colonial administration was the nuisance presented by locals at heritage sites. Hassan noted with some irritation that visiting the shrine of Nizamuddin Aulia, quote, would be rendered more pleasant by the absence of touts and beggars who generally infest the place. Heritage, as defined by the British thus, included strictly circumscribed behaviors and ways of inhabiting space, at odds with long-standing practices at shrines. One method suggested by colonial authorities for controlling undesirable communal activities was to decrease the utility of the monuments by building walls with limited entryways, which would both decrease the visitation of these spaces and also shield the view of such unsightly activities from colonial eyes. These efforts were continuously undermined and pressured by competing claims. Such was the case of the Rasul Numa Dargah, the shrine of a 17th century Qadri saint. In correspondence, the administration had described the complex as an untidy place, an eyesore, and determined to acquire all the land of the shrine, leaving only the saint's tomb and a pavilion with the graves of some elites intact, around which a wall would be built. While the documents included notes about the popularity of the shrine's annual festival, it was felt that retaining the main monument and the pavilion would be sufficient for satisfying the needs of the community, save the descendants who lived on the premises, for whom the loss would be economic, not sentimental or religious. The response to this decision reveals the fundamental disconnect between Delhi locals and colonial authorities regarding function, preservation, and historicity. Shortly after the Chief Commissioner of Delhi had granted permission for land acquisition, descendants of the saint and his disciples petitioned the government to reconsider their decision, writing 3 letters enumerating the value of the dargah in its entirety. All the letters stressed the historic and spiritual importance of the site and its renown among Muslims across the nation and even abroad. Interestingly, the letters made note of the government's award of an annual sum of 50 rupees for the shrine's maintenance, as proof of official recognition of its significance, and even suggested that more funds be made available through the Ancient Monuments Preservation Act, Act 7 of 1904, to improve the shrine so that it may, quote, harmonize with the artistic structure of the new capital. And while colonial authorities had relegated the importance of the shrine to the descendants as monetary, the letters outlined an emotional claim of belonging through personal genealogic connections to a site where the writer's ancestors were buried. Accompanying the letters was a detailed plan of the shrine complex prepared by H.M. Ajmal Khan, carefully demarcating all the built structures within the complex as well as identifying the graves. The plan indicated the presence of numerous graves, some of which were in family plots, as well as an assembly hall, multiple hermitages, homes, wells, and a platform serving as a public kitchen, all set within a tree-filled space. Through these letters and the plan, the petitioners drew a picture of the shrine as a vibrant space, teeming with activity, a space where the dead were remembered and memorialized by the continuing burials of their spiritual descendants. The case was compelling enough that the authorities relented, but in many other cases, community protests were ignored and historic structures demolished. The dargah's historic nature was also recognized by its inclusion in the list the following year, where it was categorized as being in good condition but not requiring formal legal protection. In keeping with the general approach of the catalogue, the entry for the dargah was austere, devoid of any of the vivid details provided by the petitioners, and underscoring yet again the tension between official records of historic monuments and their lived reality. I'm thankful for your patience thus far, and I'll conclude in a second. I'm not going to go into the contemporary period for Delhi, only to say that this notion of preservation of historic structures largely continued into the modern nation state, idea of what heritage constituted and how one was to act within such spaces. And this has been written very eloquently by Anand Taneja in his book Genealogy, which I highly recommend. This idea of continuing to kind of make dead funerary sites in particular. This is not to say that people do not still engage with funerary sites. Of course, the shrine of Nizamuddin Aulia is a vibrant space, but that this is a kind of continuation of that set of practices. And of course, most recently has come into contact with other political considerations in India and the contentious part of how we think about sites as being quote-unquote Muslim or Hindu or so on and so forth. I'd like to thank you for your patience thus far, and I'll conclude rather briefly. When I started working on this research, I had envisioned a very traditional art historical account of the building of funerary architecture in the subcontinent, perhaps a kind of stylistic history. Apart from being somewhat tedious, this approach seemed to miss a far more compelling narrative, that of the ways in which funerary monuments were impacting the spaces in which they were located, and the repeated investments in their upkeep and memorialization. These case studies provide a window into the multiple lives and afterlives of funerary monuments, highlighting the entangled nature of the urban funerary connection. That is, how the building of funerary spaces and the customs and practices that became part of their regular functioning informed later practices and the building of monuments around them. I chose to share my research on Severn and Delhi today because they're very different cities in scale and in importance. In Severn, we see how a single shrine can take on so much significance that it is the central organizing node of the city, impacting every aspect of its development. In Delhi, the countless tombs form a framework from which to experience the city, creating a network of them, what some might call a necrogeography. And yet, despite these differences, there are clear continuities, particularly the intrusion of funerary spaces into daily lives and experiences, and how these spaces beget communality and sociality, injecting life into and around death. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Fatima. That was a treat. And thank you for taking us to these rare sacred sites and beautiful Sufi pilgrimage sites. Yes. In a moment, Anand and Fatima will be joining in Q&A. That will be about 10 to 15 minutes. I know we are running a little late. So if you have any questions and thoughts, hold on to that thoughts. And we'll be passing around the mic. And Kayla will be helping with you in a moment. So...
Thank you for that incredibly rich and complex talk. I have three sets of questions. So the first is, do all funerary sites become shrines? So asking you to reflect a little bit more on sort of the career of shrines. Why do some become shrines? And why do some shrines become associated either with certain kinds of rituals or a certain kind of gift giving, right, or boons? Does that have more to do with whose shrine it is or whose tomb it is, or does it have more to do with how the public out there over time develops certain kinds of feelings about particular sites?
Thank you. This is a really excellent question. For the first part of your question about, do all funerary sites become shrines? No, and yet, I'll take a different case. one that I didn't discuss today of Bidar, where we have the Ashtur necropolis of the Bahmani kings. And the first Bahmani king, Ahmad Shah Wali Bahmani, his tomb is now a shrine, not as big as any of the shrines we see here, but we do see this transformation of status, where specific figures, either through their own actions, and I think in the case of Ahmad Shah Bahmani, there's definitely a sort of his own actions resulting in this eventual shift, where he cultivates a persona of being a pious individual in his time, of cultivating his connection with the Ne'matullahi order in Iran, and his shrine has a number of inscriptions which connect himself with this devotion to Ahmad Shah Wali Bahmani. Simultaneously, he's known to have patronized Lingayats in Karnataka. And so there are a number of Lingayat shrines that are also associated. They're sort of mini shrines dedicated to him. And so now what has developed as a result is at the annual festival, there's a Lingayat pilgrimage that comes to the shrine where they meet the Muslim custodian of the shrine, and there's like a kind of dual multi-confessional atmosphere that's taking place. So his historic actions have resulted kind of snowballed in a way. This is not always true. I mean, I don't think anyone thinks of the Taj Mahal as a shrine, right? So it very much is a kind of circumstance. In terms of what rituals develop, I think that sometimes in the later historical sources, we see particular types of communities attracted to shrines. So at Sevan, the Qalandars, these mystics who are rejecting any kind of sort of social norms, become particularly connected with the shrine. It's unclear whether Lal Shehbaz was actually a Qalandar. These are all 18th century sources that are telling us this. And so as they become connected with the shrine, and we sort of see how community forms around the shrine, and that in a sense leads almost naturally or organically to particular types of activities. So why you have a dhamal every week at Lal Shehbaz and not at some other shrines is, kind of the ways in which over time these ideas accumulate in a space, I think. I mean, of course, there's many, many other alternative ways of thinking about them, and some places where none of these things happen. Sometimes shrines kind of fall out of memory also, lose kind of their significance. And I think that can be a kind of almost a happenstance of just fortune's favor.
Yeah. Just for the sake of this audience, if there are many of you that haven't been to these shrines, maybe talk a little bit about the kinds of public they attract, and that typically they are interfaith, and lots of people who go to these shrines who are not Muslims.
Yes. I mean, I think historically, when we think about Sufi shrines in India, they haven't, I mean, again, we'll go back to Lal Shehbaz. There's, he's like this figure who's almost like mutating and has relevance for multiple people in multiple ways. And so they become these kind of gathering spaces where there is incredible interfaith connection, even while people are, someone is reciting a shloka at the side, someone is reciting the Quran, there's qawwals performing. So they are kind of welcoming spaces, I think, for that kind of interaction, or even sort of existing side by side. And of course, we know historically a number of Sufi texts are very much influenced by Indian mystic practices as well. And so there are historic texts which kind of, for instance, the meditation practice that we participated before the lecture can very easily be connected with yoga and meditative practices that are long practiced in India. So yes, I think that they're like these incredible spaces.
So you alluded very briefly to the changing fortunes of shrines over time. How does that process work? Why do certain saints become less renowned over time or more renowned over time? And when you sort of look at some of the ethnographies that have been done of shrines, certain shrines become famous for fulfilling people's boons.
Right.
Whether it's making sure you come first class first in an exam, or you have a male child?
Right. I think, I mean, I don't have an easy answer for this question. One is what I've already suggested today, is that elite patronage really helps. Like, if you have money flowing into a shrine, then that how can that not help, right? And that's a very perhaps cynical way of looking at it. The other way that I think this works is, as shrines become associated with particular types of hardship, people don't go to a shrine for any kind of hardship. Shrines become associated over time with, this is a place you go where you want to pray for, fertility issues, a place where you go to pray for economic hardship. And so that can, if enough, I think, of an anthropologist will tell this better, enough, I think, belief builds into a space, that begets, people going more and more, obviously, kind of a local knowledge about a shrine. And I'll give a different example from any of the ones shared here. The site that I work on for my book project, the Makli Necropolis, there's a very particular belief amongst people living in Karachi, on the way to Makli, so closer to Makli, where people go to Makli, they take pieces of the historic structures and they form these little houses. They're called khwahish ghars, so houses of dreams. And the idea associated with them is that those tiny houses are their desires sort of encapsulated in architectural form, in micro-architectural form, and that they will build a house that will look like that little architectural structure. So they are desiring a house. And it's become a very popular thing. And so every time I've been to the site, you see little khwahish ghars. The idea is that once the actual house has been built, people will take those historic materials and put them back where they were found. So sort of disassembling that khwahish ghar, because the khwahish has been received. And this is a really nice material explanation of how these things are occurring. And also, because you see them on the site, then you start asking questions about them, and it sort of develops in a very particular way.
Maybe just close with a comment on your work. Since you've written articles or given talks with titles like Joyful Walking and Feeling Subjects and Signatures in Stone and Luminescent Lotuses.
Very fond of alliteration.
Yes, these are all sort of examples of what shrines can awaken in you and evoke.
Absolutely.
So you've already talked about your particular funerary site. Are there rituals or practices you've observed that have changed over time and that also represent difference from the historical study you've done? Because yours really goes from 14th to the 17th century. How is it different in the 21st century than earlier times?
I don't know that I have a good answer for that, partly because this is a lesser studied site, and much of what we know about the earlier history, the 14th and the 17th century, is what we can glean from looking at the buildings themselves. It's a site now very popular in Pakistan. It's one of 6 UNESCO heritage sites in Pakistan. So you can understand it kind of, the kind of importance it has for national memory and particularly for Sindh's own provincial government. I think rather than how it's changed, one thing that I find when I go to the site, there's lots of brambles. And so when you're walking, you have to walk in the path that others have walked because they have sort of created those paths for us between the brambles so that your clothes don't get caught in thorns and things. So in a sense, there's a long continuity, regardless of whether originally many of them are royal tombs. So regardless of whether royal visitors were coming or now many shrine visitors, there's a kind of popular local pilgrimage to the site, you still have to follow in those same footsteps. And that's kind of where my idea of walking first came up, and then there's a 17th century source, 18th century source I should say, on walking as a practice and as an emotional practice at this site and how it can transform an individual.
Well, you who are fond of alliterations between the brambles sounds like an article you may be writing soon.
I'm going to write that down.
Has anyone been to Makli? Let's
Always
open up to
exciting.
questions from the floor. I'm sure there are loads of them. How are we going to do this? Oh, Haley, you're gonna...
First of all, thank you for your presentation. My name is Nadeem Zafar. I'm faculty at University of Washington in the medical school, actually. So I'm not, but I've extensively followed this, and I've been following what's going on because the shrines and the funeraries in India are much more supported by traditional poetry also. They have a huge history. So there's endorsement by very famous poets, which I'm sure you well know about. And the culture between the two funeraries are very different now. The mall that you talked about, I suspect, is more on the Pakistani side now than it's been on the Indian side. And that's typically and the shape that's happening in India, the culture and the religious shift that's going on. The question for you is that Pakistan, and like you, I'm a Pakistani American. So the question for you is, Pakistan is a country of about 225 million people. And I don't know very many women or men who have got so much passion about the more nuanced approach to research on what's going on and the traditions. I've seen the locks and all when I've gone to mazars, as you know what that means. What made you come to this track basically? Was that something personal in your life or your family tradition, or is that something, because this is not something that every woman would do, or most women would do, or 99% women or men would do. Why you? Thank you.
I mean, one thing I'll say that in Pakistan, and particularly in Sindh, I find is that women have far more access to many parts of Sufi shrines than we'll find in Punjab and in Delhi. So women are allowed to enter the inner sanctum frequently, whereas in other places there are restrictions on where women can go. And this has become more common over time. So people go to Data Ganj Bakhsh in Lahore, women can only enter to a certain part. And that's interesting, and it's something that I've seen. And there's something to be said for the increasing securitization apparatus that is around shrines. That also prevents study of them. I think that my own interest, I was very interested in studying Pakistani architecture. I grew up in Pakistan, I grew up in Karachi, and it's significantly understudied compared to India for a variety of historic and political reasons. And so even when I started my doctoral study, that was very much a focus of my interest. And then it was a sort of a case of kind of discussions of what I would do with my supervisor, and we sort of landed on Makli, and I went to it. And again, it started as a very traditional art historical structure, but I'm personally very interested in devotional practices and how they shift over time, and I'm very interested in social histories. And so my work is inevitably kind of inflected with that interest in how do people associate with these sites when they look at this architecture. Even when I'm talking about how people sign their names on stones, why are they signing in the ways that they are? I talk about inscriptions a lot, and my training as a medievalist is to talk about how someone calls themselves the second Alexander. So my interest is not that they put tiles on the side. That's interesting, but why did they call themselves a second Alexander? I'm like, oh. So I think there's a natural inclination in my own personal sort of biography of thinking about it that way.
Two questions.
And I think there's one in front here as well.
She got that.
Hey, thank you so much for the talk. I had a quick question because I was really interested when you were talking about people that were sort of, farther away from these main sites instead of their own, micro sites or their own way to engage with it. And I'd be curious to know what this looks like in diaspora outside of India or Pakistan for communities that might still have a connection to these saints or these people but don't have access to the sites directly. Is there pilgrimage? Is there setting up of their own sites and their own communities? What does that look like?
I don't know precisely the answer to your question, but I'll answer it in two ways. The first is I think that the internet and the presence of information and of these kind of virtual ways of accessing sites has really transformed how devotional practice takes place in the 21st century. A lot of the images that you saw today were taken from the internet. I myself have not been to India as a Pakistani, very hard. And so I think that there's now more reflection amongst academics about what it means to do this kind of virtual pilgrimage of sites. And I think this is an area that anthropologists are working on and thinking about. And one of the ways we find out information is through these ways of accessing knowledge. So I can only imagine that for those who are unable to access the site physically, that this is one means of accessing kind of the blessing. Just in the way that you can watch the Hajj online now, every year there's a dedicated channel to it. Why would the Saudi government create such a thing? So that's one answer to the question, and I had another point, but now I've completely forgotten it, so it'll come back to me.
Hi, Fatima. Assalamu alaikum. So good to see you. Thank you for that really illuminating lecture. I'm curious about something that you said about how, at least in the 60s in Pakistan, how the government started politicizing or getting involved in the upkeep of the shrines. And I'm curious to know, I understand you're a medievalist, and I'm curious to know, in what you've unearthed, how the role of the government and its involvement in its upkeep has changed how shrines appear in the consciousness in the communities, particularly as governments change. And at least in Pakistan in the 80s, for example, I can only imagine under Zia-ul-Haq the impact of what Orthodox theologians have said about shrines historically. And so have you noticed any shifting consciousness that's impacted the upkeep or the presence and and how communities have viewed those shrines as a result of the government and the political structure manipulating what they believe about?
No, this is an excellent question. Thank you very much, Sarah, for being here. I wasn't even expecting to see you. I think that this is a subject of study by various people who's, I can sort of, if anyone's interested, share some names. But I think government involvement has been very specific in which shrines were they became a focus of their attention. So, and that tends to have been very large shrines, very major shrines, because of this kind of outsized political influence that custodians could wield. The sajada nasheens, as they are known, the traditional custodians were often important political figures within both local politics and national politics. And that has been true for a number of different administrations and during times of dictatorship like Zia-ul-Haq. Part of the reason why Seven is so important is because of the Bhutto family's patronage of the site, right? So in the 1990s, when the shrine is renovated, it's through Bhutto money that it's renovated. So the political leadership in Pakistan, depending on where you are, and in Sindh, which is a space where I think Sufism is still very, very, popular and practiced as a kind of local popular practice in many places. I think the government has been not perhaps as orthodox as in other areas that they might be. So like Sharia councils and so on are not interested in the Sufi shrines. There's been almost an unspoken understanding amongst politicians in Pakistan of that shrines, while orthodox Deobandis or so on are very anti-shrines, that they are very significant sources of influence and power. And so there's been an almost a hesitancy on the part of the government to dismantle these structures, because the government can take benefit of them, as it does in places, right? It inserts itself into these shrines and benefits from the influence of these figures. And of course, many of these figures are not religious figures alone, the custodians. They are also politicians themselves. And so they're helping promote how it happens. So that's kind of like a very quick answer to, I think, what is a very complex question.
Can you talk a little bit about how these have been safe spaces as well from the growing orthodoxy that pervades? There's almost like this conflict between Sufi Islam and Orthodox Islam, and also about how I think you mentioned that how these spaces have evolved over time. I mean, there was a terrorist attack on Seven Sharif just only 5 years ago, and but then that same space was reclaimed a few days later by Shima Kermani. She went and performed a dhamal over there. She's a leading feminist of Pakistan. Can you talk a little bit about that, perhaps?
Yes, I think, I mean, I hesitate to make Seven such a focus. I think other shrines as well, the histories of some of these Sufi saints, I think opens them up to be welcoming spaces. The kind of poetry that they are known to have written has been transgressive, right? And so that allows entry by its virtue of like the kinds of texts that are circulating in these spaces, the kinds of practices that are circulating. They tend to attract people who have perhaps not found belonging, or who are not traditionally welcome in other spaces. This is why there are more, intersex people, more women at shrines than other spaces, because they can sort of intrude into those spaces. Now, that's not to say that traditionally Sufism has not also been kind of a patriarchal structure historically. It has had its moments of like sort of exclusionary activities and its own kind of status building. But some of these particular mystics, these antinomian mystics, by virtue of their biographies, I think, allow for people to find that safety. And there's a lot of patronage for some of the more, for things like Qawwali, right? These gharanas that are associated with Sufi shrines. And they become really, even very orthodox figures still enjoy listening to Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan sing, Lal Meri Pat. And so, is it, I don't...
You might just, for the audience, gloss Karana.
Right. Oh, right. So Qawwali is the singing, the kind of Sufi devotional music that we heard before the meditation started. And Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, who performed famously in Seattle, was perhaps one of the most famous modern performers of Qawwali in sort of global consciousness, I think. And so there's a very famous Qawwali known as Lal Meri Pat, which is about Shehbaz Qalandar. And so, and he came from like a traditional gharana, a household of musicians. So, these sort of hereditary musical homes. So the kind of wider popularity of particular forms of what we might think of as Sufi devotion, right, that are also being listened to by people who aren't listening to it with necessarily the perspective that it is Sufi devotion that they are listening to, right? They're listening to it because they enjoy the music. That also creates a space for Sufism and Sufi practice to exist and persist.
Perhaps we will take one more question.
Thank you very much for a very illuminating talk. I was wondering if you're ready to speak a little bit about your book on Makli, and maybe give us a little bit of a historical perspective.
Sure. So the Makli Necropolis is, as Anand was also saying, this vast funerary site. It's in the deltaic plain of the Indus Valley, so it's very close to the coast. And it was built sometime in the late 14th century by the Sama rulers of Sindh, who are basically a vassal state of the Delhi Sultanate at that time. And then, for a variety of reasons, it's a site that becomes the kind of royal funerary site for numerous different political dynasties that rule over Sindh. So you have essentially centuries of continuous construction on the site as more and more monuments are built. What is particularly interesting about them is that the monuments do not follow a particular architectural style. And they kind of, what ends up happening is we can look at these monuments that start with these stone chhatris, these open pavilions, canopied pavilions, to then brick domed monuments, to then tiled and like these kind of glorious tiled monuments that look like they could be in Central Asia and Bukhara or something like that. All of these are accumulated into a singular space. And so one of the things that I have written about the site is kind of as this archive of the changing people that inhabited southern Sindh from the 14th to the 17th century. That as we see the mobility and migration of different groups into Sindh, Makli kind of serves as a way of archiving their presence. And these were both political elites, but also artists migrating to Sindh. And so we see the transformation of Makli as a technological shift as well, where we see new artistic practices and technologies introduced, new building practices introduced into the architecture of the site. So that one of my big interests is in the movement of people across space and how that reflects in the built archive. And then there's a sort of a coda almost of the site as we think about then Makli as it's being presented in later historical sources, as once this site has come up, how is it then remembered? How is it imagined? Who are the people that are made meaningful through these later memorial practices that we might think of the text? So that's in a very sort of short way talking about the book.
Thank you, Fatima. We have one enthusiastic audience question.
I was wondering about the parallel. We talked about the Pakistani government influence on shrines. I was wondering about the current government in India and whether that is kind of making those spaces less available to different kinds of people, hardening them, and maybe making that experience kind of flatter and more homogeneous.
Yes, I think that's an excellent description of the activity. So the Lingayats, who I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure I'm going to do a good job of explaining what Lingayats are. They're the Hindu practitioners who are Shaivites, if I'm remembering correctly, so followers of Shiva, who are non-Brahmins. Very importantly, sort of this is this anti-caste almost group. And what we find in the Bahmani necropolis is that, and with Lingayats in general in southern India, is an increasing casteization and Brahmanization of their activities through local sort of influences of Hindutva nationalist politics. This infusion of Hindutva nationalist politics is transforming Lingayats, who have traditionally been anti-caste politics. And so even in a space that you would, in a kind of practice that you would expect it not to happen, Brahmanization is happening. And so I think that reflects that is a kind of example of what national politics are doing to sites and practices in India. I'm not an expert, so I don't want to, I don't know enough about, I'm very familiar with how the Pakistani government works, not as much with how the Indian government works.
Please join me in thanking our speaker.
Thank you, Anand. Thank you, Fatima, for this wonderful talk and the moderation. Also, audience, for your participation. I'm learning from all of